Hey guys, my name is Mannequin. Welcome back to Mastering EDM with FL Studios. So today we're finally getting into the limiter portion of limiter number 6. And this is where the fun really begins. This is where we start to learn all about what really makes tracks loud in the mastering stage. I'll try to go through this briefly since we had a really long video last time. But this is fun stuff, so we'll learn some stuff, and we'll also go through and kind of learn how to apply this limiter instead of just learning the what each knob does and stuff like that. So it'll be a lot more fun checking around to make sure things work in this particular mix because we have a couple different areas to bounce around and check. Anyway, let's get into this. So the first part here that we have is the gain, and that's pretty obvious. We just pull it up or down to adjust the level. And then we have the threshold. This is basically the ceiling. What do we not want it to go past in terms of our volume level? So if we set this to -4, it won't go above -4 dB. So that's one of the two major components of this. You just kind of adjust the gain and the threshold to get it where you want it, and that could be, you know, where you could just cap it and say, boom, that's all you need to know. But we're going to learn these other things as well because they're quite useful. So we have different modes here. Each of them has their own tone and their own kind of features to them. And then we also have different types here, each once again with their own tone. And then finally we have linked and unlinked options when you turn this peak limiter on. And then we have a speed that you could adjust. So first of all, I'm going to start having the speed set to normal, and I'm going to set the peak limiter to linked for now, just to make things easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull the threshold all the way down. And then we have the gain up at an unreasonable value, given that the threshold's so far down. And we're going to listen to the sounds of these various types, or the various modes, I guess, and kind of learn what the different tones are and how we can choose which one we want. So that's brick wall, and it's pretty easy to tell because of the way things distort and sound all crushed and stuff like that. So that's the worst one to use. And quite frankly, at this point, I don't know when you would actually use a brick wall limiter. I think it's the only time you'd ever use it is if you want something to like not go past it for technical reasons. Like you're like, hey, if I let this go past a certain level, then I'm just going to be screwed. So that could be a reason to use brick wall. Otherwise, the tone just kind of sucks on it. So I'm going to start this at brick wall and then move it to soft and listen to the difference there. So it still sounds pretty distorted, but it's less distorted. So that's kind of what soft does. It's the same principle as brick wall, except it actually lets a small tiny bit through the top, just to kind of allow some dynamics there, and it doesn't sound quite as distorted because it has that free range to work with. The next one here is mid-side, which we talked about a little bit on this one. It's the same principle, but it sounds, it's a lot more obvious when you hear this one. So I'm going to go from brick wall to soft and then to mid-side. Take a listen to that. So there were two big things that you probably noticed there. The first one is that this one doesn't really sound like it's distorting that much. And the second thing you probably noticed is the stereo imaging of this changed drastically. The stereo portion of the track kind of sounded like it was really pushed up to the point to where it was almost drowning out the mids. So that's kind of, you know, as I mentioned before, we have mid-side. And we need to be a little bit careful with it because we don't want to push up the sides too much. But at the same time, if we push them up a little, we could really, really fine tune the stereo imaging of our track. So that's a great positive to this particular type, or this particular mode, I should say. And then the final one we have is multiband. And that one's going to be kind of following a similar trend here. So I'm going to start with brick wall and then move all the way over to multiband. And you could take a listen to that. So as you could probably tell there, as we went from brick wall all the way over to multiband, things just got clearer and clearer. So the verdict is not necessarily you should always use multiband, but that's pretty much what I always use. So soft is, I'd reserve using soft for pretty much ambient styles or acoustic styles or things like that where you kind of want a soft tone to your track. But for most like hard-hitting EDM, like techno, electro and trance, dubstep, all that fun stuff, future house. You pretty much want multiband. The only one I'd go other than multiband for those particular genres is mid-side, because that one lets you adjust the stereo imaging a little bit, which could be beneficial. So that's up to you, if you want to end up going to that one. But pretty much I always use multiband. But now you know the differences between these two and the different tones they have. So pretty much, yeah, we're just going to stick with multiband for this one. And next we're going to listen to the types. Actually, I'm going to stick this to brick wall because it makes the types easier to discern. So I'm going to play this section over here and take a listen to the main lead. It's going to be pretty stinking loud, but as I switch through the types here, you'll notice that it changes in its tone. So it kind of smooths out. For A is the sharpest, and it smooths out as you get to C. So I'm going to move it to multiband because this is where it becomes pretty obvious in this one as well. So you can really tell we're pushing it there, but that's the difference in tone. My suggestion is for pretty much like the hard-hitting EDM styles, just go more towards A instead of C. But pretty much type 2 is also a good type to go with because it's just in the middle ground. It lets you balance, have the best of both worlds. A little bit of the fullness of C and a little bit of the crispness of A. So that's kind of where I'm going to stick this for now. Because I already went and mastered this track, or messed around and tried to do a little master here. And I stuck it on 1 at first, but then I decided to move it over to 2 because of how this particular track kind of deals with a high end. So now that we know those ones, that's pretty much for adjusting the tone. The speed here also adjusts the tone. As we move it up to 1/3, it slows the limiter down and kind of makes things smoother. So we'll take a listen to this. So once again, same principle here. So I just keep this one at normal just because I like the brightness of normal. And then finally, our last switch here is linked and unlinked. Which one do we choose? Linked is it takes the bass and it makes it and it compresses it in it views it in a mono sense. So what it does is if you have a really high amount of bass on the left side, and once again, this is only linking and unlinking the bass, not the entire stereo image. But if you have a lot of bass on the left side and like very little bass on the right side, if you have them linked, it pushes them both down. But if you have very little bass on this side and a lot of bass on this side, and you set it to unlinked, it just pushes the really loud bass back down. It does not actually push this right side down because this right side already is down to a point that's decent. So you might think, well, then obviously we'll stick it to unlinked and let it compress both sides so we get both sides as loud as possible. But personally, my opinion is go with linked. And the reason is because most of your bass should be in mono anyway, so you shouldn't be getting much variance in terms of the left and right sides and the low end. So if you start to compress them differently, you're going to get times when, let's say, you have a note with a little bit of bass and it's on the same spot as your kick drum, and they hit at the same time, and this note is kind of balanced towards the left. Then what's going to happen is it's going to compress the note and the kick drum, and it's going to balance out the bass on both sides. This means that you're going to have a lopsided bass drum. And it's going to just like your kick is just going to kind of get pushed out of the way for that really heavy note that you're dropping that's kind of not on center. So that's why you don't really want to do unlinked, because it'll kind of make things uneven. If you set it to linked, what it'll do is that weird note that's off center will push down your bass drum as a whole. So it will not, it won't like throw the balance out. It'll just kind of push it down out of the way. So that's why I suggest linked, because it kind of just gets rid of those weird cases where you could potentially be having really weird stereo effects for your bass, which you really don't want. So, so I stick this to linked, but that's just my personal preference. You could choose unlinked. It won't kill your sound. It won't hurt it that bad. In fact, I don't even know if it'll actually hurt it. It's just kind of one of those stylistic things. Once again, you choose the type that you want, and you choose the speed that you want, and you choose linked or unlinked, although I do actually suggest linked for this one. So that's pretty much all that you need to know in terms of technicalities. Now let's have fun and get this mastered. So first we're going to set the gain to 0, and then we're going to set the threshold to 0 as well. And we're going to turn down the threshold to around somewhere around this area over here. So that's not all the way up at the top. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pull up the gain until we start to feel like it's clipping. So, so let's go ahead and do that in this area right here. So that's about where I could start feeling it kick in. So we're going to leave the threshold there and pull up the gain now. And that's about where I want it. Now you could tell I pushed it up a little bit further and it did sound louder, but the high end started to sound like it was kind of gritty. So it doesn't let the clarity through anymore. It just kind of starts to get this sort of sound instead of a so that's basically the difference that we're looking at there when I'm choosing to turn it down. So I'm not pushing it quite as hard. Now that said, some people actually like that tone and they master and they push it up and crush that high end a bit. I prefer to leave that to the final stage when we do some more digital clipping. And I just realized the output is boosted up, so that's kind of falsely messing with us here. But we'll try this again. I'm going to bring up the gain and we'll try to balance this with the output not clipping anymore. I kind of like it right about there because that's the sweet spot between it sounding too squashed and not being loud enough. So that's kind of the balance we're making right now, as opposed to pushing it to the point to where it's actually getting distorted. So we are going to mess with the digital clip later, and that is going to add a little bit of grittiness in, but we won't worry about it quite yet. So that's pretty much all we have to do. The gain and the threshold, because we already chose our mode and we already chose what type we want. Now, I could flip through the various types, so I'm just going to tell you right now. I went to this one, and with this one, it kind of sounds a little too harsh, and this one, it sounds a little bit too, it sounds a little bit better as opposed to these two more dull sounds here. So that's why I chose the middle. Too harsh over here, too dull over here, so go for the middle. Okay, so now the final thing we need to do before we wrap up here is we need to check around the various parts of our track to make sure our master still works. Normally what you would do is you'd play through your whole track and make sure it all sounds good. But the reason I'm jumping around is because I don't have that much time, and we'd be here forever if I did that. So I'm going to show you some trouble spots you need to look for. The first major one is obviously when things get super loud, like this peak right here. So I'm going to play this back, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't sound super distorted when it gets this area. And hopefully it won't, and we won't have to do anything to adjust it. Nope, no distortion there. So the next thing we want to check is generally the louder areas. So you can see this area is louder than most of the other track areas. It's kind of like the middle of this area right here is about higher there. So so we're gonna check this area next. And I changed the type there just because I think I do like the brightness a little bit more. But the one reason I kind of pulled it out was because the final area you need to check And this is what I mean by areas you need to check. Once again, these are the areas you need to look out for most, not so much the areas that you only need to check. You need to listen to your whole song. You need to make sure the whole thing is great. This is the area that is actually probably the most problematic when you have really loud stuff and you're mastering for that. You switch to the really quiet stuff and it changes it drastically. So we're not hearing any clipping right now. And it's pretty much good. You'll find when we go to this protection here and we start to push things up with the protection, you'll start to hear some distortion on this this drum that I have right here. So I'll turn it up a little bit. So that's why you have to be careful about the digital clip there. So that's one of the things you need to worry about most in your quiet areas. But anyway, that's pretty much all I have for today's video. We covered the peak limiter, learned quite a bit about it. Now what you can do is you could bring the threshold up a bit more and turn the gain up a bit more and balance at a higher level. And that way you won't actually have quite as much headroom for the clipper or the protection. But you won't have, if you don't like the digital clip or the other types here, which we'll talk about later, then you could actually do most of your mastering in this spot and just kind of move stuff up. Instead of doing that for this particular video, I am going to actually wait and pull things up a little bit more with the clipper and the protection, just so that we could get a chance to look at those. But it is up to you. Once again, you can, push things a little bit louder, turn up the gain, turn up the threshold, and deal with more of that there instead of in the final stage. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. In the next video here, we'll talk about the high frequency limiter and the clipper. We might have time to hop into the protection, but I doubt it. But yeah, we're slowly plugging our way through this. And after these, we finish limiter number 6. As I said, we're going to talk about EQ and some other things that are rather helpful with mastering. But for now, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.